This is Chapter 8 of The Americans, Section 3 and Section 4, Life at the Turn of the 20th Century. Section 3 is entitled Segregation and Discrimination. The main idea of this section is that African Americans led the fight against voting restrictions and Jim Crow laws. In this section, we'll begin by reading about Ida B. Wells, an early civil rights leader, who, after watching three of her friends lynched by a mob of white people, describes the experience in this section right here, where she refers to it as an effort to keep the black race terrorized. In many ways, this is an accurate description of the experience African Americans underwent for hundreds of years of white rule, one of a rule by terror. Ida B. Wells goes on to describe why African Americans were lynched on such a regular basis. In her opinion, and much evidence supports this opinion, African Americans were often targeted by whites because they began to succeed in a capitalist system and began to acquire wealth and property. When whites saw African Americans succeeding when they were not, they lashed out with violence, hatred, and murder. On page 287, you'll read about how African Americans were treated throughout the United States, but more specifically also in the southern United States. Voting restrictions are detailed here, and you'll read about two of them: the poll tax, which was a tax that had to be paid before anyone could vote, and a grandfather clause that allowed for a literacy test if someone couldn't afford the poll tax. This meant that if someone could not pay the poll tax, they could be allowed to vote with the use of a grandfather clause, meaning that anyone who could state that his grandfather could vote before January 1st of 1867 didn't have to pay the poll tax. The date is important because before that date, African Americans were still slaves. Therefore, they had to pay the poll tax. White voters were therefore allowed to not pay the poll tax. Jim Crow laws are detailed here. Jim Crow laws began almost immediately after the Civil War and were put in place to deny African Americans their civil rights. This picture in the upper corner shows one example of Jim Crow laws that created separate movie theaters for African Americans so that they would not mix with whites. The same laws also created separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate swimming pools, and separate lunch counters for African Americans. The legal support for Jim Crow was upheld in the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which was a court case that argued over discrimination on railroad cars in Louisiana. The Supreme Court famously decided that if a separate but equal car could be provided for African Americans, they were not being discriminated against. Therefore, all Jim Crow laws that allowed for separate but equal facilities would therefore be legal under the Constitution. This ultimately leads to the creation of a separate educational system for African Americans, one that will be undone in the next 70 years by further Supreme Court cases and the civil rights movement. Take a moment to pay close attention to the bottom of the page, where you'll see a section called Turn of the Century Race Relations. In this section, you'll find examples of how everyday discrimination and racism were imposed upon African Americans. African Americans could never expect to shake the hand of a white person. They always had to walk on the street when a white person walked on the sidewalk, and they always had to remove their hats before talking to a white person. Debate between African American leaders is detailed on page 288, where you'll read about differences between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Remember that Booker T. Washington argued that African Americans should get along with white people in order to improve their status in society, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois refused to put up with the violence and discrimination that was common for African Americans at this time. In this section here, you'll see how he helped to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, where he argued that we are men, we will be treated as men, refusing to be treated with anything less than the proper respect according to man, just because he was a black man and not a white man. The violence that faced African Americans is detailed in a very small paragraph right here on page 288. And it says very, very briefly that between the years of 1882 and 1892, more than 1,400 African American men and women were shot, burned, or hanged without trial in the South. What was their crime? Breaching the etiquette required of them when dealing with white people. If they didn't speak politely, take off their hat, or cast their eyes down when speaking to a white person, they could be lynched. Discrimination and violence towards African Americans didn't just take place in the South. It's a mistake to think that discrimination only took place in the South. In fact, it took place in the northern states as well as the western states. And in this section, you'll hear about how African Americans and Native Americans and Mexicans were all discriminated against because of their differences from the white majority culture. Chapter 8, Section 3 ends with a description of the treatment of minorities in the American Southwest, which was expanding as more people moved into the area at the turn of the 20th century. The expansion was made possible through federal intervention and financing of public projects which often employed laborers from Mexico. These laborers, including African Americans, were often forced into debt peonage, a system that bound laborers into slavery in order to work off a debt to the employer. This ultimately was found to be unconstitutional. However, it is important to understand that the desire to enslave minorities under capitalism continued into the 20th century, and it did not end at the end of the Civil War in 1865. Chapter 8, Section 3 ends with some vocabulary terms listed here. Please continue to add these vocabulary terms to your growing list of vocabulary flashcards. Chapter 8, Section 4 is entitled The Dawn of Mass Culture. The main idea for this section is that as Americans had more time for leisure activities, a modern mass culture emerged. On page 293, you'll read about 3 new leisure time activities that became popular among Americans at the turn of the 20th century. The first was to attend new amusement parks on the outskirts of cities, where rides like roller coasters and amusements like fun houses entertained people who suddenly had more leisure time and more free spending money in order to enjoy these new entertainments. In addition to amusement parks, bicycling and tennis also become huge new popular pastimes. Bicycling actually had not only a social impact for everyone, but particularly for women, as women now were able to ride on bicycles and have more movement, more transportational freedom than they ever knew before. Notice the quote by Susan B. Anthony, the famous women's rights advocate, who said, "I think bicycling has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance." More leisure activities saw a rise in spectator sports that were popular among the masses. Previously, sports had been the exclusive domain of the wealthy. But now, as more people had more money and more free time on the weekends, they were able to attend new sporting events, boxing and baseball. Baseball was an interesting American tradition that began in 1845 in New York City. Today, it's known as the American pastime. However, it's interesting to note, like many things in the American past, baseball too has a racist history in which there was 2 leagues. one for African Americans and another for white players. The development of mass media is symbolized by the rise of newspapers, which were purchased by the new population that could read. Newspapers at this time were controlled primarily by two major publishers, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who competed between each other for circulation and for the manipulation of people's opinions when it came to understanding the news of the day. Another artistic form that was promoted through mass media was the Ashcan School of Art, which showed common everyday scenes in new and bright colors. On page 296, you'll read about how popular fiction began to take off at the turn of the 20th century. As more people could read and had more spending money and free time to read, they purchased new novels that were published primarily in paperback. Successful writers included Jack London, Willa Cather, and Mark Twain, who we all remember for his book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. With new leisure time and more spending money, new ways to sell goods were developed for the American consumer. Urban shopping included the department store, first found in Chicago, as well as new chain stores like Woolworth's. New ways of shopping brought new ways of advertising goods to shoppers. And on page 297, you'll read about advances in advertising, as well as new catalog shopping, in which people in rural areas of the United States could order products that were available only to people in cities and have them delivered to their small towns via airmail or regular post office mail. Chapter 8, Section 4 ends with a list of vocabulary terms listed here. Please add them to your growing collection of vocabulary flashcards.